Good afternoon, everybody. It's now 2 o'clock and it's time to open the hearing session for matter 11, which concerns other policies. My name is Phil Milam and my colleague is Kevin Ward, and we are appointed by the Secretary of State under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 to carry out the independent examination of the Folkestone and Hythe District Core Strategy Review. You all know who Caroline is, but she's the Programme Officer. Caroline, can you just confirm that you can see and hear me okay?
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Milam. Everything is fine, thank you.
Thank you. Looks like we've got a few people who I caught the introduction in the lobby that there's some participants who are not joining us. So I'm not expecting anyone else in the session necessarily. So we've got a manageable number of participants that hopefully allows for everyone to have who's speaking to have their camera on at the same time. But what I think it might be useful to do, just bearing in mind that there are folk who are going to be interested in watching the sessions on YouTube, just to do our usual introductions, even though we're all familiar with who we all are at this stage in the examination process. So if I can just start with the council's representatives.
So good afternoon, my name is Paul Shadarivian, QC, acting for the council.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Adrian Tofts and I'm a policy specialist with Folkestone and Hythe District Council.
Thank
you. Good afternoon, my name is David Whittington. I'm the strategy and policy senior specialist for the District Council.
Thank you. And I know you've got a couple of colleagues who are in the meeting, but I presume they'll introduce themselves if they come on camera and speak at the relevant points. I wasn't going to necessarily carry on and read through my extensive opening session for the afternoon, other than to just have the usual reminders about not sharing documents and obviously observe the usual protocols of using the hand raise function and muting and unmuting at the appropriate time. You should all have a copy of the agenda, which has a number of points in it. In light of sort of where we are with the examination, I think there will be some areas that when we set up these agendas that we've probably covered in some depth already. So there may be areas that there's just one or two small additional points to cover, and there'll be some other areas where perhaps I've got a few questions. So what I was going to do for this session is to ask the council all of my questions under all of the sub bullets for each one. So CSD3, and we'll start and I'll go through all of my questions on that. And then I'll give Mr. Horner the opportunity to raise any points at the end of that if necessary. And then we'll try and do the same just to try and sort of keep the movement of the hearing session reasonably fluid for all concerned. So if that's agreeable with everyone, what I'll do is I'll move straight into my first sort of questions on CSD3, if I may. And I'd like to thank the council for their sort of very thorough sort of response in their hearing statements to these to the questions. And there was a sort of high-level question that had been set in relation to the approach to rural and tourism development being justified and consistent with national policy. And in your statement, essentially, I'll just sort of summarise the council's position is in fact the policy is largely a sort of roll forward of the previous incarnation from 2013, and you've sort of said that you don't consider the policy to be sort of out of date, and therefore it's sort of largely presented as was. I suppose I just wanted to sort of ask to what extent the policy wording may or may not have been sort of updated from the 2013 incarnation. Is that Mr. Tofts?
Yes, thank you, sir. I don't think there have been many updates from the 2013 version. Looking at national policy in the MPPF and planning practice guidance, we still feel it kind of fits the bill in terms of the approach. Most development would be directed to the settlement hierarchy, which we've talked about in a previous session, and this is really looking at development that might need to go outside that hierarchy for affordable housing or agriculture or whatever it might be. Tourism is a major component of the district's economy as well. So it's kind of dealing with these other land uses and issues, and we believe it largely meets the bill carried through from the previous plan.
So sort of my reading is it appears that the policy is intended to apply to sort of all forms of rural development, including sort of rural housing and those types of proposals that may necessitate a rural location. But what I just wanted to also understand is the relationship of this policy to any other sort of linked policies in the PPLP, and whether there's anything in there that supplements what's in CSD3.
Yes, thank you. So there are policies in the Places and Policies Local Plan, which was adopted in September last year, which would complement policy CSD3, and those include policies protecting existing employment sites, policies promoting tourism. As I said, there is quite a large tourist economy in the district, and in the local plan we have a policy specifically dealing with static caravan sites and camping sites, farm diversification and reuse of rural buildings, safeguarding community facilities, and there is a general policy, NE3, which generally seeks to protect the countryside and key landscapes like the AONB, etc. So there is a suite of policies sitting below this policy, which contains more detail.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think what I was sort of wanted to just sort of focus in on a little bit was just some of the specifics of the wording of CSD3 that I just sort of like to understand a bit more, because whilst I sort of appreciate there probably is a detailed suite of other policies, and I don't want to sort of tread on the toes of those necessarily. Sort of having a look at the wording, sort of starting in the first paragraph, it then talks about development in these locations will only be acceptable in principle, and then what we have is essentially dare I say, a fairly closed list of requirements under bullets A to H. And I suppose really what I wanted to sort of understand was why the policy was seeking to limit types of development within those specific criterion, perhaps when the framework adopts perhaps a less of a closed approach.
Yes, we thought in this policy we've kind of captured exceptions allowed for in the framework, but I mean possibly possibly it could be reworded to say give these as examples rather than the only acceptable forms of development. Or I'm struggling to think what else might be acceptable in a remote rural location other than.
I think where I'm sort of where my attention's drawn is things like in terms of if the approach is covering sort of rural housing, the framework talks about proposals for rural workers. Now you've got sort of criterion B that talks about development in these locations will only be acceptable if it's for agricultural, forestry or equine, but does that also include accommodation for those who have an essential need to work in a rural area, and is the framework as specific saying agriculture, forestry or equine rather than what it actually appears to say, which is rural workers? So what I'm trying to understand is that there's a specific reason for narrowing it down to those things, or perhaps whether there is a slight inconsistency with what the framework's saying there.
Yes, probably on reflection that could have been better phrased, that part of it to include the workers that might support these enterprises as well as the various different enterprises themselves.
Yes, I think there is a slight disconnect there in terms of the wording. So I think that probably is an area that might merit some further exploration, possibly through a main modification, to reflect perhaps more closely what the framework's intention is there. In terms of sort of some of the other sort of criteria, I didn't have any particular sort of. I think it's more the approach about locations will only be acceptable, and having that quite strict interpretation of what then follows in A2H. So perhaps Mr. Horner, do you want to come in at this point? I know I said we were going to go through all the bits, but
yeah. So we have made a comment about item F, which kind of suggests that you could take a building that contributes to the character of its location and convert it potentially into something that doesn't contribute to the character of its location. And we've suggested a rewording to make it clear it's the conversion, or the conversion plus the building, which needs to contribute to the character of the location.
Yes, and potentially the opposite could also be true, that the conversion of a building that doesn't make a particularly positive contribution could be converted to one that then does.
Exactly. So we have suggested building conversions that contribute to the character of the location. So the result is what matters rather than what you start off with.
We've got that, thank you.
Yes, I think that's perhaps a further case for another look at the wording in there. Yes, that was one Mr. Horner I did actually have recorded in terms of in criterion F. Okay, well, I think you probably got the indication that perhaps it would be prudent to have another look at those criterion and that closed list point in terms of the first paragraph and then those bullet points. So well, I'll leave that one for perhaps Mr. Shadaravian to find his pen, because I think there is.
I'm thinking now. My mind is whirring.
Yes. Well, as I say, I think I'm never a great fan of considering modification wording in its precise and final form on the fly, but I think you've got the indication that there is a potential inconsistency with the framework there, and you perhaps need to.
Yes, I think just looking again at the framework, we need to build in some flexibility into the policy as well. Yeah. Okay, I've got that.
Okay, splendid. So just sort of having a sort of look then sort of further down the paragraphs in terms of CSD3, looking at the sort of second sort of paragraph of text that follows criterion H, and the policy talks about sustainable development in the countryside, and the loss of facilities in the centre of a village will be resisted. And I suppose I was sort of interested firstly in what you mean by centre.
Yes, I think perhaps that again that could be better expressed. There is a policy in the local plan which tries to safeguard community facilities, and I don't think that sort of specifies where they have to be. So it would seem it would seem best if that part was redrafted to fit more closely with the adopted local plan policy. I'm just bringing it up.
I think again where I was sort of going was, I mean, it comes sort of back to that discussion we had around the tiers of the settlement hierarchy, and obviously if
Yeah.
they're based on particular services and facilities, obviously it's not unreasonable to want to protect those things which give rise to their identification in the hierarchy. But I'm presuming that you didn't have the unintended consequence of not seeking to protect facilities on the edge of or just outside the village settlement boundary or otherwise. So I think it's just sort of, again, it's probably a case that I think the wording here perhaps isn't as clear as it ought to be, and I think perhaps in that case, I think what you're saying is, I can understand that position, but yes, I think it probably does need to be a modification there to try and.
I think it should be loss of community facilities in villages will be resisted. And I think also the viability issue needs to be firmed up a bit more so that one is required to look at alternative community uses before it's actually used for some other purpose or redeveloped.
There is.
I was just going to say.
Sorry, there is policy C2 in the local plan, which requires evidence of marketing and for a minimum period, and before we would countenance the loss of a community facility.
In which case we can make sure the two are consistent then, and maybe put in a cross-reference to the PPLP.
Yes, I think, as I say, there's no to necessarily in the PPLP, but
Okay.
again, have a look at that centre, I think, so I'll put that on my list there. Just sort of then sort of turning to the sort of issue of services and facilities itself. There was some text there in terms of what those might be considered to be, and I know in the council's statement you indicated that you also consider a modification. I think you said it possibly in the appendix on page 174 to the glossary, to sort of look at perhaps the wider definition of community facilities. There's things like pubs, shops, places of worship, etc. weren't covered. I think my question was going to be, yes, was there a specific reason for excluding those? And you've said perhaps you recognise that should more fully reflect all of those things. Because if those are criteria against which you've designated particular places as in the hierarchy, again, they probably ought to be cross-reflected in this policy so that those aren't inadvertently lost in the flow through of policies in the plan. So I'd probably suggest that there is an issue there to pick up.
Yes, I think the definition in the 2012 core strategy is probably much tighter in terms of community facilities than is subsequently been introduced through the MPPF. So it was just a suggestion that we try and bring the glossary in line with what is in the MPPF. So there's no dispute about whether a particular thing is a community facility or not, really.
Yes, well, I mean, as I say, I've highlighted the issue. I mean, if you think that there is a more appropriate location for it than the glossary, then give that consideration as well, whether that ought to be in the supporting text. I'm not being prescriptive in terms of where I think that should be. That's a matter for the council. But yes, I think that definition there does need to be considered more widely. I think on the basis of sort of those points, I think in terms of what you've said, I didn't have any other specific questions on CSD 3 other than that which we've discussed, and obviously look forward to receiving in due course thoughts on what those modifications need to be. But we've got them all recorded in terms of the areas that need some further amendment. So, Mr. Horner, was that your only point in terms of CSD 3? In that case, what we'll do then is move seamlessly on to CSD 4, which deals with green infrastructure and natural networks. In terms of the overall approach to CSD4, again, if perhaps the council would just like to just briefly sort of introduce the rationale for the policy as it stands.
Yes, thank you. This is intended to be a kind of overarching policy for green infrastructure assets throughout the district. It deals with issues such as biodiversity and sites of special scientific interest and etc. There are more detailed policies in the local plan, setting out the hierarchy of biodiversity sites, and also development management policies that would give more detailed guidance on landscape considerations, such as the Kent Downs area of outstanding natural beauty. There is the green infrastructure strategy that supports this, and we are in the process of updating that at the moment. And we are about to go out to stakeholders on a consultation exercise to update that. But in addition, we have done a considerable amount of work with our colleagues in Rother District Council on the sustainable access and recreation management strategy for the Dungeness complex of sites. Through this examination process, we've also agreed, or I should say, we've put forward some suggested main modifications to this policy, and would refer you to the Statement of Common Ground with Natural England, EB 12.98, and also with Kent County Council, EB 13.10. So there would need to be amendments to accommodate those if you are minded to accept them.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Toss. I picked up those, and thank you for raising them. So I suppose there's the two areas of modifications. One was there was a request for amendments to the supporting text that talked about planning applications to be supported by ecological surveys, mitigation strategies where required, enhancement plans, in order to follow and apply the mitigation hierarchy. And then there was a further modification to CSD 4D, which I think was from the Natural England Statement of Common Ground, which talked about including local wildlife sites, and so amended wording there. And then there was a further change to the introductory text in Part A, which talked about CSD 4A, which talked about achieving net gain in accordance with the latest central government requirements and demonstrating a net gain plan and secured for 30 years. So can you just sort of run me through why the policy is not sound without them?
Those came at the first two you mentioned came from Kent County Council, I think, and they are of the view that local wildlife sites need to be specifically mentioned because they were left out of the list in bullet point D, I think it was. And their view is that it is an important network of sites that needs to be reflected in the policy. We are aware that as we've been going through the process of drafting the plan, we have the Environment Bill going through Parliament, and Natural England have sought changes to reflect that. and so it is part of the statement of common ground with Natural England that we included reference to that. I think Natural England wanted a particular reference to 20%, but it seemed to us that it would be best to have a general reference to accommodate any changes that may come through the enactment of the Environment Bill.
Thank you.
But perhaps I could add, as it stands, it probably isn't as forceful as it could be, given what is likely to be enacted through the Environment Bill in terms of a biodiversity gain rather than just the avoidance of loss.
Mm-hmm. No, that's not. Thank you. No, I understand the position. And in terms of the securing for 30 years, that's a flow through from the legislation that's moving through. And do you think the plan otherwise addresses the suitable mechanism, provides suitable mechanisms to ensure that is secured for that length of time? Do the other policies in the plan reflect how that will be dealt with practically?
Sorry, sir, I was just cross-referencing with the infrastructure planning policy, SS5. It could perhaps be strengthened to include reference to the long-term maintenance of those biodiversity sites.
Well, we've got SS5 sort of on the list for this afternoon. So yes, perhaps keep that thought in your mind as we go through, Mr. Tofts, and then we'll come on to SS5 a bit later on. I think from my perspective, I mean, I think there is clearly an issue there in terms of reflecting particularly the points around local wildlife sites and ensuring that the supporting text does reflect the points made by the county council. So I think that's an area that merits some further clarity in the policy to ensure it's effective in that regard. So I think that's probably something again for consideration of a modification there. Just making. And perhaps we'll keep the other points in terms of Natural England in mind as we go through. Mr. Horner, did you have any points you wanted to raise in terms of specifics of CSD4? No. Okay, I can see you shaking your head.
Found it.
Okay, thank you. I didn't have any other specific points in terms of CSD4 overall. Again, I think your statement covers the majority of those points, and we've discussed some of the potential issues raised. I did want to spend a little bit more time on CSD5 in terms of what's proposed. Now, I'd sort of said an overall question on relating to CSD5 in terms of its justification and consistence with national policy. But I'm mindful that as part of the early discussions in relation to the Stodmarsh issue, that there are some fairly extensive modifications that have been put forward in the Statement of Common Ground with Natural England, and that's in EB 13.95. I just perhaps wanted to perhaps dive straight in with those. I think is probably the best way to deal with it, rather than asking you to sort of rehearse a lot of the background that we've already had in terms of the background to the Stodmarsh issue, which I think we've probably covered as a matter of principle. What I wanted to understand a little bit more about, we've obviously got additional policy text, supporting text, and there's a figure 5.4 that's been put forward in that statement as proposed modification. Now, in terms of the figure 5.4 and the extent of affected catchments, is it the case that those catchment areas are effectively forming some kind of initial screening for the purposes of undertaking a habitats regulations assessment in relation to the nutrient issue? Or is the approach to identifying those schemes that may require an HRA different in any way?
Yes, by way of introduction, that these catchments have been supplied to us by Natural England as the likely affected areas for the water draining to Stodmarsh, and it was our intention really just to have that represented in the plan more for potential developers to highlight the potential issue to them, really. So because I am aware that in the policy we have talked about development which could have an impact on water quality, so it seemed prudent to have some indication of where that might be in the district, really. So that was the intention behind that plan.
Yes, but I'm assuming also that plan also appears to show areas outside of Folkestone and Hythe district. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry. So yeah, it could be when the final version of the plan is produced, it could be the actual plan itself could be improved so that it's only looking at development within the district boundary, and it's a bit clearer in terms of its resolution. Yes,
because I think where I sort of was going to sort of come on to a little bit was obviously the approach you sort of there's text in new criterion D which says development which could have an impact on water quality. But I'm assuming that will be looked at by the council on a case-by-case basis rather than attempting to make it more straightforward, perhaps for small-scale, minor householder development, various other things that aren't going to have an effect on water quality, to not have to be sort of effectively screened into and screened out of a habitats regulation assessment. Again, thinking about sort of the effectiveness of the policy. It's, I suppose, how you're going to identify the types of development which could have an impact on water quality.
Good afternoon, sir. James Hammond here, Planning Policy Senior Specialist. In terms of the background to the Stodmarsh issue, figure 5.4 as proposed has been inserted in many ways to exert the precautionary principle. So the Stour catchment is split into a number of sub-catchments as presented in figure 5.4. So includes the Upper Stour, Little Stour and Wingham and Lower Stour sub-catchments, and they are duly colour-coded accordingly. In terms of how would we apply a screening type assessment, that figure kind of rules everything in. When it comes to planning application stage, we will have the ability to look at in greater detail whether or not a single application site connects in via wastewater connections as well as surface water connections. So if you take what might be a single windfall dwelling up in the North Downs character area, I know through engagement with Natural England already that the reason why it's ruled in is that in due course, Natural England are going to look at each subcatchment in turn, and the more distant a subcatchment is from the Stour, from the Stod Marsh, the greater the likelihood that it could actually be ruled out in due course. So the reason why it's in is because there is a chance that surface water discharge from a single dwelling could interface with the Stour catchment, even if the wastewater connection doesn't allow it to do so. We have wastewater mapping at our disposal through GIS, and Stodmarsh really is to deal with wastewater. The reason why the subcatchment reflects such a broad area is because transmissivity of surface water means that it's ruled in until it's ruled out, which is what that screening work will do. And as a development management principle, the council is already looking at the interaction of single application sites, so single dwelling application sites, and what it means for the Stodmarsh European site. So we're already going through that process. So the applicant, in each case, an applicant will be required to demonstrate their compliance with the policy, which effectively is presenting information to show how what impact a site will have or otherwise not have, and it's at that DM stage that we can get that finer grain of detail. Whether the policy has to be added to reflect that requirement, it might be something that we take away and reflect on.
Yes, I think there's a few. We'll come on to a few other sort of areas. I think, and I understand the need for additional wording to obviously reflect the Stodmarsh issue, and I can obviously see that work has gone into that. I think it's just trying to understand again what might then sit behind it, and then flowing from, pardon the pun, flowing from that, what might be expected of particular forms of development in terms of will you be requiring additional evidence base for, even if it goes down to single dwelling level, I can understand that, but will it go down to domestic extension level? What's the balance? What's the burden on the wider forms of development? So I understand the need to try to rule lots of things in, but equally, again, it's having a thought about what that might mean in practice and what comes from it. So I won't sort of further that point at the moment. What I did want to talk about was in D part 2, the criterion reflects the applicant can demonstrate that the development will provide all requisite mitigation measures. I suppose my question is, we had a little bit of discussion about it in relation to the garden settlement, but my question applies equally to wider forms of development. If some of the mitigation for this is not able to be achieved on site, what are the sort of consequences of the policy wording where this may need to be secured off site? I.e., direct provision can't be secured, but an off-site solution could be, or solutions. Does the wording allow for that?
Yes, so perhaps on reflection, it could say it could make reference to connection to to off-site mitigation, perhaps to an off-site mitigation scheme, or
I think it should refer to all possible solutions, actually. So we will build that into the policy change.
Yes, I think that would be useful, because we don't want to rehearse all of the theoretical.
No.
I am aware that there are potential ways of dealing with some things off-site, and as I say, because this policy is potentially going to catch so many forms of development, that perhaps needs a bit more thought, I think, in terms of effectiveness of the policy wording.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll look at that most certainly.
Okay, thank you. I think that probably picks up most of the points from other participants who aren't present. So we've sort of covered that side of things in terms of justification and consistency with policy. I'm also mindful that we have, to a degree, covered quite a bit of the discussion around water efficiency standards in other sessions, and I think that's probably the position on that has somewhat been settled through other sessions in terms of the justification. So I'm not going to take a valuable examination time going over that again. You'd be pleased to know.
All right.
What I do want to have a bit of a discussion was on the requirements for non-residential development to achieve the BREEAM outstanding standards, because there has been concern raised about the policy requiring outstanding, and there's been some concern raised that perhaps the policy ought to reflect the excellent standard rather than outstanding, due to the potential differences in water requirements of a range of development uses. Really, I wanted to get the council's, unfortunately, the representations, we don't have the representative with us who made that particular comment, but I was just keen to understand what the council's position was.
Yes, thank you. So I think on reflection, it is probably best to refer in that point to the local plan policy, which sets out a requirement, and I think we've probably on reflection we've got a bit confused with our standards. So I'm just searching for the policy in the plan. Sorry, forgive me, I can't find it now. Yes, policy CC2 has a requirement for very good standards, so for non-residential development, and it has a caveat where technically feasible and viable.
Mm-hmm. Yes, again, I was sort of going to ask whether the person who made the comment had any particular types of uses in mind, whether they felt that there wouldn't be the ability to achieve the outstanding standard. But I think on the basis that you've indicated that elsewhere in the development plan, you said that there's a policy that requires very good standard as a minimum, and perhaps the outstanding is an aspiration rather than a policy requirement as such.
Yes, thank you, sir. I think that's correct. It's probably a bit of sloppy cross-referencing on our part. Yeah.
Okay, then. In terms of that element of the policy, Mr. Horner, did you have a comment on that element? I was just going to, if you didn't, I was going to move on to.
I don't think so. Although since it's been brought up, I mean, this is only in relation to water. BREEAM outstanding standard. I'm afraid I'm no expert, so I don't know what that means in terms of litres per day or whatever. But since I'm ignorant, I'll let it go.
Okay. Well, if the council wants to provide Mr. Horner with a brief resume, then now would be the time. But if not, we'll move on.
I don't have the standards to hand right in front of me, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, on the basis that perhaps none of us have those at our fingertips,
Never mind.
we'll perhaps leave that one where it
Let
is.
the experts sort it out.
But Mr. Horner, what I was going to move on to is that, I had a general question in terms of sustainable drainage and flood risk, and I noted you'd made a representation in respect of there's no evidence in the policy in terms of potential for groundwater flooding in this policy, and I wanted to sort of understand the council's position.
Would you like me to summarise it, sir?
Yes, I was going to say I've done probably
Clear enough.
a better job of summarising your own representation than I can. So,
it's just, I mean, we have members on our committee who live down on the marsh, and every time it rains, heavier than normal, we get these reports of drains backing up, and it affects the lower lying villages, or even parts of Lydd have this problem. Over recent years, when developments have been brought forward, it appears that the drainage authorities' response is that they don't particularly want to provide mains drainage for these people, and that's led to a plethora of packaged treatment plants serving individual houses. I can understand that, sort of dotted around the countryside, but even more extensive developments have been encouraged to put in their own sewage treatment, if you like, rather than making use of mains drainage. And it seems to us that this has the effect that there's no money available to sort out the problems of the existing mains drainage. And I just thought that as a council responsible for the area, they ought to be interested in this problem and trying to run it to ground, if you'll excuse the pun, with the, I think it's Southern Water, who are responsible for carrying away the foul water. But it's a problem which will get worse as sea levels rise. The problem of keeping groundwater levels down in the marsh, if that's the desirable thing, will increase. So I just wondered if there's any way that this document could at least include some aspirations to improve on the matter.
thank you, Mr. Horner. Give Mr. Tofton an opportunity to have a think and come back on that. My sort of question is that issue dealt with elsewhere in the plan in terms of consideration of groundwater flooding? And I was drawn to perhaps SS3 rather than CSD5, but I'll let the council respond when they've had a moment.
Yes, thank you, sir. Policy SS3 does include, as you say, criteria relating to flooding in zones identified by the Environment Agency. But perhaps perhaps it could specify more closely all forms of flooding.
Could I say this isn't about flooding per se? This is about the consequences of flooding, or not necessarily surface water flooding that was visible on the surface, but in occasions when the groundwater level gets so high that the existing foul water system is overwhelmed.
Groundwater flooding would be a recognised form of flooding that would need to be picked up as part of individual flood risk assessments, would it not?
So, I thought flooding just meant that there would be water visible on the surface, but I mean it's the same. It's the same causes. Yes. As I say, the consequences are not that you can't walk across the road because it's wet, but that you can't use your loo because it's backing up into your house, which is happening down there on occasion.
Thank you. No, I understand the point. Well, I think this is an area perhaps where we may be in some danger of whether there's a soundness issue or whether we're not in the business of trying to sort of improve policies. We've got to understand whether there is or isn't a soundness issue. But obviously SS3 does talk about those areas at risk from flooding, and whether that might be the most appropriate location. I noticed there were some things before Christmas. We talked about SS3, so I think there probably were some thoughts needed to go into SS3 in terms of amendments, and maybe that's one to think about whether that's addressed through the modifications you'd already suggested.
Yes. So if I may, I mean, we are talking a lot here about development and what happens in the future, and new properties being built, new developments being built out. What we're talking about is an existing problem. I mean, obviously there are a lot of existing problems in infrastructure around the place, for which the solutions might be some contribution from a future development. But I think we'd just like to see that issue acknowledged in this plan somewhere.
I'll give it some thought, but my main concern is that we should be following the MPPF and its requirements, and obviously defer to the Environment Agency and the SFRA in order to guide the policy and also our management approach to development. I'll give it some thought, but in the absence of an evidence base that suggests we ought to be, as it were, applying another layer to what's required at national level, I think would be quite difficult. So I'm somewhat pessimistic about actually introducing any such thing into the policy itself at the moment.
I understand that. I mean, there are other avenues I think we can pursue by bringing pressure to bear on Southern Water outside of this process.
Yeah, I think that's what's going to have to happen if this becomes a big issue. But I don't think at the moment the evidence base supports a change to the policy, and certainly not one to make it more effective within the parameters of existing government guidance.
No, I mean, I thought it might be worthy of mention in the notes to accompany the policies in some way, so that
that's possible.
People didn't forget it, and it was brought to the attention of developers who might be coming in from the outside who weren't fully familiar with the situation down there.
I think I understand respective positions on that point. So thank you for those. What I was also sort of just wanted to run through some further suggestions in terms of modifications were also suggested. I've picked up one that talks about in criterion C of CSD5 in terms of the requirement for SUDs for major development unless it would be demonstrated to be inappropriate for particular reasons. I just wanted to understand that suggestion from the council's perspective.
Yes, thank you, sir. I'm not sure whether that was something that came from Kent County Council's statement. Three point 3.1.
I think it was Mr. Tofts, because it's referenced in your statement from paragraph 3.45 onwards.
I think they were keen that to stress that it might not be suitable in all occasions, and I think it was a reference to development on previously developed sites where you might have to adopt alternative measures. I think was where that one came from.
We're going back to the sort of point on ground conditions and things. It may not just be previously developed sites where it may be very, very challenging to implement such. Is that the case then, Mr. Tofts?
Yes, thank you, sir. Yeah, I think that was where that suggestion came from. I think it was a policy statement that Kent County Council published as the lead local flood authority. That so I think that's where those changes came from.
So in terms of that sort of first one, is it around SUDs not being required where they're technically not feasible rather than just not?
Yes, I think it was to allow for sites where the ground infiltration or whatever might not be technically feasible. I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, I think that is an area perhaps where some further consideration in terms of the effectiveness of the wording might be needed in that regard. And then contained in the same sort of paragraphs, there was some further suggestions in terms of surface water runoff should match greenfield discharge rates and volumes, and for previously developed land should reduce discharge rates and volumes again where feasible. And those have emanated from the county council as the local flood authority. And again, in your view, those changes are necessary for soundness, are they?
Yes, we thought they should be included for soundness.
Because effectively there's sort of development management requirements that are going to be sought by the council on schemes. So again, to aid effectiveness, what you're saying is those changes need to be made. Okay.
Yes, to help development management colleagues in determining planning applications.
And presumably that then, again, pardon the pun, flows through to policies in the PPLP that then will set out in further detail what's expected. Is that right?
Yes, there is a detailed sustainable drainage policy in the local plan, which talks about the mechanisms to be put into effect and there is also accompanying text that talks about the adoption and management of sustainable drainage. That's policy CC3 of the local plan.
Thank you. I think that was all of the modifications that I'd recorded through various statements and documents. Was that it from the council's side as things stand? There's a fair batch there. Okay. Mr. Horner, did you have any further points on the specifics of CSD 5?
No, sir. I'm afraid I got lost in the last 5 or 10 minutes, but it all sounds good to me.
No problem. Okay, well, we had a further agenda item that talked about the relationship to the places and policies local plan, but I think actually as we've been going along, we've probably covered most of those areas, and you've given me a good indication of all of the suite of policies that sit elsewhere that complement what's put forward in CSD 3, 4 and 5. So I wasn't going to go further into that for the sake of airtime. What I did want to have a brief sort of discussion at was just to really sort of flag up where we're at with SS5, particularly in light of where we've got with things like the discussion on transport infrastructure. I was going to sort of originally, when I sort of set out the agenda, sort of talk a bit more about where the policy sits in terms of infrastructure delivery funding requirements, key elements and phasing. But I think on the basis of the information that's due to be submitted and the sessions we're going to hopefully have on transport in due course, there's probably not a great amount of merit at the moment in furthering the discussion on SS5.
I think I would agree with you, sir, actually. We will have plenty of time, hopefully, on the next sitting day to go through most of this, and we may even go into the extra day, who knows. But I think once we have that note, things will become a lot clearer.
Mm. Yes, I mean, I think the sort of only sort of generic point I was going to make on SS5 was perhaps a point for thinking about rather than for now, if we're going to sort of park SS5, but was to think about whether the policy ought to reflect some of the wider sources of funding that might contribute to strategic infrastructure, for example, the IF funding, various other mechanisms that sit outside of the Section 106 approach and the Council's community infrastructure levy, and whether or not, in light of the role some of those funding streams might play in delivery, whether they ought to be reflected in the plan.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'll perhaps leave that thought hanging for the time being until such point as we can come back to SS5 again. I'm mindful again others who've made representations on SS5, including Hythe England, aren't here today, so perhaps we won't take it any further at this moment. Mr. Horner, was there anything else you wanted to add on, perhaps on the wider points of SS5, or are yours
No, sir.
specific? No. Okay.
I'll look forward to the transport discussions.
Indeed. In that case, I've probably reached the extent of my sort of detailed questions on the policy areas that we can cover at the moment. Obviously, we had a bit of a resume with my colleague this morning on where we are, or indeed aren't, with the transport side of things. But I think it's for, and as Caroline mentioned earlier on, at this stage, obviously we aren't in a position to identify a date until we've received further information. So on that basis, the session we'd originally programmed tomorrow is of course postponed, and then that will be picked up as part of the additional time we're going to need in due course. I think we talked about having a couple of days set aside for
yeah.
areas. So So from my perspective, that is the situation as it stands this afternoon. So I had nothing else to add. Did anyone else have any final points on these other policies, or any other policy areas that we haven't in any way covered as yet?
Not on areas we haven't covered now.
I've covered at least once so far. Mr. Horner, have you had the opportunity to say everything you wanted to on other policies?
Yes, thank you very much. I just wonder whether I could just raise something which I've been kicking around in my head. Just thinking, and this is totally off topic, I'm afraid, but might be worth thinking about going forward, and it may have no bearing on the plan itself, but I'm just thinking about the plight of the poor residents of Barrow Hill being surrounded by this thing called Otterpool Park, and whether there was any scope for kind of redefining the various areas which stand to be developed, such that, for example, the park which is called Barrow Hill, which is actually on the hill itself, might be considered at some point down the line as part of Sellinge rather than part of Otterpool Park, and that would go some way to assuaging our concern that Otterpool Park can't be perceived as a standalone settlement with boundaries around it. Whether that's something that would necessitate any changes to this plan, or whether it's just something which could be taken forward subject to the approval of the residents, or the acceptance of the residents. I'm not sure they're going to approve anything, to be honest, which might be taken forward in the governance, in the question of governance of that whole area in the future. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Thank you. I think just sort of from my perspective, and I think it's probably something that at this stage all we can do is note your comment on, and mindful that we've obviously had quite a bit of discussion on the garden settlement and Sellinge, and obviously there would be other participants who would have been perhaps most interested in having that discussion who aren't.
Surely, yeah.
So I think from that perspective, I'll just make a note that you've raised that point, and obviously as myself and my colleague Mr. Ward have quite a bit still to consider in relation to the plan in general and the garden settlement. So thank you for raising that. Otherwise, I had nothing further to raise, and if the council had nothing further to raise, I was going to bring this session to a close. I'll give a final call to Mr. Ward, who's in the background, whether he has any final points. And if I don't see his hand up, I'll take that as a no. No, he's had long enough to put his hand up, so I'll take that as a no. So
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We will be in touch with the programme officer as soon as we're in a position to furnish you with the information which we've promised, with the view of then you identifying what days would be suitable for you and others to resume the examination. So
thank you for that. Yes, and noted, and we'll obviously await for that information. So thank you for confirming that position. So otherwise, I shall close the session for matter 11, and no doubt we'll be in touch with participants in due course about further sessions when further is known.
thank you very much.